2010 science fiction heist movie, was written and directed by Christopher Nolan and produced by Nolan and his wife, Emma Thomas. Nolan exerted total creative control over the movie, so, as Nolan typically demands, the movie is constructed as much as possible out of practical effects, much more than other directors of the time might have considered possible, rather than computer-generated imagery. Okay, wait. Before I get too far into talking about Inception, a couple notes. I'm going to talk about a bunch of different works, but I've taken some care, and I'm pretty sure the only one I reveal any important plot details about is Inception. For the rest, I try to couch my discussions in terms of what they're doing and how, but I do spoil the hell out of Inception. There's a lot to say about Inception that I don't get into here. It's absolutely not a perfect movie. There are a lot of problems. As always, I'm not going to be overly even-handed by listing things I don't like that don't have anything to do with the point. There's more to say about cyberpunk and works in its genre than I get into here. I do say some negative things about cyberpunk and some authors in the genre here. I want to clarify at the outset that I absolutely understand what people like about it, and I also have enjoyed many of those things about it. I even, like everyone else does, wrote a cyberpunk novel when I was 15, and it was garbage. Okay? Okay. Filming for Inception took place in Japan, Morocco, England, France, the United States, and Canada. Even though there are strict regulations surrounding helicopter filming in Tokyo, when a scene was supposed to take place atop a skyscraper in Tokyo, that's what was filmed, complete with helicopter shot. An entire mock-up installation was built in Fortress Mountain near Banff to maximize the authenticity of skiing scenes there. One set was built on a single, enormous gimbal, and other sets for which that wasn't sufficient were built to rotate completely over each other. The famous hallway fight scene required a 100-foot-long set pulled by huge motors to turn rapidly at speed with remote-controlled cameras on rails running across the length of the hallway, and Joseph Gordon-Levitt performing his own stunt work to make the mind-bending camera movements possible. As a side note, despite all of these decisions, creating a unified vision of what the project was going to be in advance and constructing it with as little CGI as possible actually kept the budget fairly low. Not low exactly, still a blockbuster film budget, but lower than you'd expect. Even filming in all those places, even with an all-star cast of Leonardo DiCaprio, Joseph Gordon-Levitt, Tom Hardy, Elliot Page, Michael Caine, Marion Cotillard, Cillian Murphy, and Ken Watanabe, Inception's $150 million official budget comes in lower than most of the highest-grossing films of its year or the year before, including Transformers, Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows Part 1, Iron Man 2, Tangled, and Up. And obviously, listed budgets are far from perfect, but they're the only point of comparison at hand, and I should really look into how much movies cost and why. In other words, Inception is a massively successful auteur blockbuster, is the opportunity Hollywood gave Nolan for the successes of The Prestige, Insomnia, and the two Batman movies. And its blowout success with both critics and audiences cemented him as the kind of filmmaker who could make whatever he wanted with Hollywood's support, because whatever he wanted was always going to be both decent and marketable, like a modern day sort of Hitchcock position, maybe. Even as an auteur blockbuster, it's not Fury Road. It's not the precise vision of a director who has internalized every tool at his disposal and already knows how to create every shot in the movie. Instead, it's a creation that exceeded the technical knowledge of Nolan and his team, and that they had to find ways to rise to meet. And since that's all so cool, I'm not going to talk about any of it anymore. What I'm going to do is try to persuade you that Inception is kind of a cyberpunk story, or more specifically, that it succeeds in doing the same things that cyberpunk is trying to do at its best, in more or less the same ways. It's tempting to say that cyberpunk came out of noir. This turns out to be a kind of reductive. A lot of cyberpunk consciously invokes noir, insofar as noir is a preceding form that helps to contextualize some of what cyberpunk is trying to do, but the early cyberpunk creators didn't talk about being influenced by noir, really. And that actually makes a lot of sense because the heyday of noir was separated from cyberpunk by like 40 years, and the real neo-noirs weren't really getting started quite yet. There are two direct media sources for early cyberpunk, and conveniently all the early sources I'm going to talk about have talked themselves about being inspired by them. The first of these is paranoid fiction, the titans of which were Hunter S. Thompson, Kurt Vonnegut, and Philip K. Dick. Possibly the most important thing you'll see in paranoid fiction is this incredible elevation of the psychological vulnerability of the protagonist. The concept of the unreliable narrator gets taken from that ordinary level, the Catcher in the Rye level, and ramps it up like 1,000,000%. Read literally, the protagonists are usually going through this weird, over-the-top, unreasonably important stuff, but it's walking this knife's edge of total implausibility, and that's the point. Many of these stories are semi-autobiographical, which folds back into the uncertainty because truth and fiction start to mingle in odd ways through these multiple layers of iffy storytelling. Paranoid fiction, especially later paranoid fiction, tended to have a sense of left-wing, alienated anti-political politics and interest in these very internal, disconnected, again, alienated protagonists and omnipresent masculinity, as I'm going to get back to later, and an interest in using altered states and this kind of befuddling of reality to draw interest to the psychological state of the protagonist and to the disconnection of the protagonist from society. On the other hand, there's some of the more well-known works from the pulpy side of sci-fi. Pulp sci-fi produced a lot of really amazing work, but it got a little diminished in the public eye because A, it is pulpy, and most of it was bad, and even the good stuff often shared a shelf or even a volume with work that was terrible or essentially pornographic or both, and B, because nerds between then and now kind of decided it wasn't real sci-fi unless it obsessed over geostationary orbits or came with a technical manual. Among these, you might cite the first couple years of Judge Dredd, certainly the works of Alfred Bester, who was one of the greatest sci-fi writers of his era, and even more than those, of a graphic novel called The Long Tomorrow that appeared in English in America in a heavy metal magazine in 1977. The Long Tomorrow is a major acknowledged aesthetic source for the creators of all of Akira, Neuromancer, and Blade Runner, and also for Tron, which I won't talk as much about here. And in fact, the writer and artist of The Long Tomorrow contributed designs for Blade Runner and Tron. To some extent, you could argue that The Long Tomorrow is the aesthetic source for all of cyberpunk, except for how dramatically far back cyberpunk reins that sensibility in. And yes, that's a phenomenally weird thing to say about a comic that's not particularly engaging with any kinds of serious ideas, that's kind of a parody of noir, that's exactly the kind of gross-out quasi-erotica you'd kind of expect from a 1970s heavy metal story. Or maybe it's not that weird once you get into what exactly those great first cyberpunk stories were. Quick note, I'm going to talk about parody a couple more times here, so I just want to note that what I mean by parody is not that the work as a whole is a comedy, but that certain genre elements are escalated to absurd levels to draw attention to their absurdness, which is humorous, but also, and often more importantly, reflects on the genre. In terms of the defining works of cyberpunk, you can name any number of them. We can discuss whether The Terminator is cyberpunk, whether Brazil is a founding work or inspired by cyberpunk or more a kind of parallel thing, whether Tron is a founding cyberpunk work or just an aesthetic inspiration for some cyberpunk. And you could talk about RoboCop, probably should talk about RoboCop, but I just won't because it's so the same but different that I just don't have time for it. There are some other cyberpunk writers that I'm going to get to in a couple of minutes, so if you're thinking of them, hang on a sec. I'm going to start with 3 works from 3 different media that are basically universally treated as both the core inaugurators of the genre and as among the very best the genre produced. And conveniently, they're analytically pretty easy because they were so prominent and their creators were so publicly accessible that we've heard a lot from them. Released in June 1982, Blade Runner tells the story of a police bounty hunter in a near-future Los Angeles who tracks down escaped, quote, replicants, androids that look human, and to euphemistically retire them. Directed by Ridley Scott, who demanded extensive revisions of an already heavily modified screenplay, Blade Runner is, in plot terms, an adaptation of Philip K. Dick's novel Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep. However, the tone of the novel and many thematic elements have been scaled way back or changed completely. Blade Runner makes aggressive use of neon and fluorescent lighting to create a neo-noir visual aesthetic. The production design kind of follows Scott's previous work, Alien, in jacking that lived-in part of lived-in futurism way, way up. In Alien, this was really claustrophobic, but Blade Runner is full of these overlarge, crumbling spaces that make society seem decaying and the protagonist seem small. These, plus the electronic ambient score by Vangelis, establish some defining aesthetic elements. Another story would end up forgettably straightforward by portraying the replicants completely sympathetically, but in Blade Runner, the urgent desire the replicants have to be free, which is completely sympathetic, is merged with a pattern of antisocial behavior. Deckard's job is brutally necessary. It's wrong that his job exists, but that wrongness isn't solved by Deckard deciding not to do his job. Along the way, Deckard is dealing with the psychological trauma of the violence and the insularity of his job, and with an identity crisis that he isn't really positioned to articulate. What this all does in combination, the tone, the score, the absolutely amazing design, the performance, is create this ultra-sharp relief, this over-heightened reality, this slight persistent dissociation, onto which is projected a problem of maintaining identity, humanity, in societies governed by wholly indifferent systems. Published between 1982 and 1990 and adapted into a landmark anime in 1988, Akira, pronounced something like Akira in Japanese, but apparently Akira is considered an acceptable pronunciation, thank God, is set in the near future in a city called Neo-Tokyo, an entirely new Tokyo built in Tokyo Bay after a major disaster. I'm going to go lighter on Akira because it's honestly just not a favorite of mine. It's a little too baked into media forms and cultures that I don't have the right context for. But Akira is the story of Tetsuo Shima, a young biker gangster who develops dangerous psychic powers and ends up way over his head in shadowy conspiracies and corrupt politicians, and that's not even the weird stuff. The ending is different in important ways between the manga and the anime, and the topics are a little different from Western cyberpunk because 1980s Japan is facing different problems than 1980s America. To a significant extent, what Akira is about is generational, about social revolution and the conflict between a young, urban, consumerist generation and an older generation entrenched in old Japanese codes of honor and formalism. But the consumerists pretty sympathetic, and the older generation a little more unsympathetic. It's a whole thing. Akira's more explicitly punk aesthetic is a big influence on the genre, both in Japan and in the West. It's actually the only one of these 3 media that aesthetically draws a lot from actual punk subcultures. In terms of plot and themes, Akira reads a little more positive than other cyberpunk work, a little less desolate, though not hugely so. And the major question is struggling to assert personhood against monolithic social systems that see self-expression as an annoying deviation from the relentless progress of something. Okay, Neuromancer was published in 1984. After multiple years of writing the debut novel by then 36-year-old William Gibson, Neuromancer is a techno-noir story in the very near future about Henry Dorset Case called Just Case. So we're already like 90% of the way to names as on the nose as hero protagonist. Case is a very, very down on his luck ex-hacker who can no longer plug his brain into cyberspace, which isn't so much a virtual reality here as a sort of common virtual interface that makes it possible to rapidly process the relationships between network databases and the code that governs them. At the ripe old age of 24, Case has torpedoed his own career, lives in capsule hotels in Chiba City despite apparently not speaking a word of Japanese, needs drugs to get through the day and more drugs to do anything other than just get through the day, and gets by almost entirely on the pity of people who aren't really his friends. We've taken the darkest parts of the noir tropes here and turned them up another 150%. Just how pathetic Case is what makes him an appealing recruit for someone shadowy to do something shadowy. His drug addictions and neurological damage repaired in exchange for his assistance with a job that rapidly spirals out of control. Neuromancer is extremely noir and very generally near future, and the least thematically clear of these, but it is obsessed with identities being, as with Case's identity, the identity of a character named Lady 3 Jane, and the identity of the character the title is referring to, and with the ways in which global human-created systems just sort of keep going on, regardless of how anyone affected by those systems actually feels about them. Neuromancer is actually just drowning in ideas. This is a key part of how Gibson approaches writing in general, vacuuming up idle lines and phrases and excerpts that he hears everywhere and reproducing just all of them onto the screen. The other big thing about Neuromancer, which I want to raise so that I can come back to it later, is that like The Long Tomorrow and like to some extent Blade Runner, it's not just noirish, it's doing noir as parody, placing Case's retreat into a noir identity not as something to be admired, but as something to feel sorry for. Inception resists a simplified plot summary. The movie begins in medias res as Dom Cobb, played by Leonardo DiCaprio, washes up on a seashore near a Japanese keep and is brought to meet the old Japanese man who seems to be in charge there, who recognizes a small top that Cobb was carrying. We flash back what appears to be several decades to a scene where Cobb, apparently the same age, and his associate Arthur are running a scam on the same Japanese man, Saito, played by Ken Watanabe. And what we immediately learn is itself a dream as they try to recover something from his mind that in the dream is locked inside a safe. Their plan is disrupted by the abrupt appearance of Mal, who seems to be Cobb's ex-wife, who we initially assume works for Saito. The scam collapses, they get most of the information, they wake up. Then there's another complex scene where we realize that they were actually in a second layer of dream, actually conducted inside the mind of Nash, Cobb and Arthur's, quote, architect, while on a train ride together. Nash messed up though, and Saito realizes what's happened, is impressed. They all wake up. The team apparently gets away safely. Outside the dream, Cobb is staying in a hotel in Kyoto where he first checks to make sure that he's not dreaming, intending to kill himself to wake himself up if he is. Then he calls his children, who we learn he isn't able to go home to see, and importantly, see a repeating bit of imagery of Cobb remembering his children playing outside, though we aren't able to see their faces. And we also learn that the children are being taken care of by their grandmother because Mal, Cobb's wife, is dead. We are now 15 minutes into the movie, so instead, let's talk about the specific key character through lines here. A, Cobb has a complex relationship with Saito, his employer, because he is relying on Saito to follow through on the bargain Saito has made with him. But Saito has already lied to him and coerced him, and is promising to do something that's kind of plausible, but that he might not even be able to deliver. But on the other hand, they do seem to find some common ground, and the ending of the film rests on the desperate appeal he makes to Saito, who shouldn't trust him, to do so. B. Saito is a powerful man, but one forced into this weird gamble by the owners of what may be an even more powerful conglomerate that may destroy his. In the conclusion, he has to choose to trust Cobb, which is specifically what he is spending the whole movie refusing to do, even insisting on coming along on the whole enterprise to monitor Cobb. C. You initially get the sense that Robert Fisher, the young inheritor of a major company conglomerate, is a little too small-shouldered for what's about to be put on him. But the major question he struggles with, in a sense what the characters are trying to persuade him to struggle with, is recontextualizing that topic. Not, am I up to this, but does inheriting this role oblige me to take on an identity that isn't what I want? If the heroes are successful, Fisher spends his life and wealth trying to find himself. If they fail, he instead inherits his father's position, a position that does nothing for him, and that he does only out of a sense of inertia and obligation to a man that never showed him any love. Though briefly, the team grapple with the ethical ramifications of Inception, which has only been done once before and with disastrous consequences, and end up framing it as a kind of therapy. D. Cobb is breaking apart psychologically, infected by his memories of the person that his wife became after spending a lifetime inhabiting a place of pure subconscious called limbo. And the fact that the shadow of a person he loved is constantly with him subconsciously means that she poses a constant threat to anyone who shares a dream with him. His inability to deal with this problem almost ruins the entire team, so he has to confront this idea of Mal that he himself created and defeat it. This confrontation is set up multiple times in the text, most directly in a conversation with Ariadne, while the team is all in the first dream level. Literally says, quote, "Your guilt defines her, it's what powers her, but you are not responsible for the idea that destroyed her, and if we are gonna succeed in this, you have to forgive yourself, and you're gonna have to confront her, but you don't have to do it alone." So, in the very literal sense that it involves technology that doesn't really exist, and it involves getting a team of people to break into something together, Inception is a science fiction heist movie. Some people call it a reverse heist movie, but it doesn't concretely mean anything. A heist movie is just a movie where a team of people have to get into a secured place and then get out. A reverse heist movie is the same story. And that construction on its own doesn't mean that much heist movie anyway. For example, The Matrix is, in pure form, a heist movie. On its own, it doesn't get you anywhere. From Nolan's interviews about developing the project, we know that both the sweeping science fiction tone and the visual touches that we now think of as distinctly Nolan, as well as a lot of that plot structure where the heist movie formula comes in, were late additions to a psychological horror concept that had been bouncing around for about 10 years and was directly inspired by 3 movies about constructed realities from 1998, 1999, The Matrix, Dark City, and The 13th Floor, all 3 of which are stories that are at root about different forms of control and about maintaining identity, all 3 of which are essentially direct responses to cyberpunk, and 2 of which are even at all decent. Now, I don't know if Nolan knows the legacy of cyberpunk and where those stories are coming from. It seems likely that he doesn't, or only knows it in the broad strokes, being as, like Ridley Scott before him, he's more of a film nerd than a sci-fi nerd. In some cases, that can be a problem. For example, Nolan's lack of familiarity with the pitfalls of superhero stories is a big problem with The Dark Knight Rises. But it's clear with Inception that what is happening is that he's picking up a lot of the same ideas Cyberpunk was interested in. So the first thing to note about the earliest iteration of the cyberpunk genre, at its best, is that it has never been about the technological near future. I had to replace my copy of Neuromancer recently, and in the introduction to my new copy, he writes, I suspect that Neuromancer owes much of its shelf life to an almost perfect ignorance of the technology I was extrapolating from. Where I made things up from whole cloth, the colors remain bright. Gibson and Scott and Otero use the near future as a facsimile of the present, specifically not so close that you can go, well, it's not really that bad, but equally specifically not so far that you can go, well, that's another world. The second thing to note about it is what they aren't, and what they aren't is incredibly punk. They're a little punk. There's punk culture. But in terms of the authors and what they're doing, they're in on the subculture, or really any subculture, is dramatically more limited than what either the Paranoids or some of the pulp cartoonists were doing. But there's things about punk culture that they find resonant with their own slightly more normie experience. And one thing they have in common with punk culture is the way in which what they're writing about eventually became infected with their own misreading, with elements intended to highlight the alienation of consumerism, globalization, and elements of urban society, instead being construed as celebrations of those things. There's a similarity in terms of the 80s reaction to the perceived victory of the right over the counterculture a decade earlier, in terms of a fundamental question of the nature of identity to punk culture also. But these works are not about identity so much as the absence of it, or as Gibson himself said it in an interview, when I heard critics say that my books are hard and glossy, I almost want to give up writing. What I'm talking about is what being hard and glossy does to you. The settings take place in huge urban settings, drawing attention to the anonymity and ordinariness of the protagonist. The use of noir and crime fiction genres helps establish a negative tone and alienation. And film noir specifically is a useful reference because noir uses city settings like alleys, rooftops, nightclubs, restaurants to undermine the privacy of the protagonist, deny the protagonist a place which they dominate. The basic identities and motivations of the characters are cast into sharp relief, and the combination of their vulnerability and their inability to open up is a key part of the tension. And this again is inherited from the paranoid fiction genre, but is leveraged through that noir lens. In terms of a political message, I'll come back to this later, but the political point comes from a place that is recognizably left-wing to some extent. Considering the heritage very left-wing, it's also recognizably anti-globalization. But the biggest political point, to the extent that this kind of cyberpunk has any political point, is this post-counterculture political alienation. The sense that the corporatists and the corrupt won. Not politically, but more importantly, culturally, and that therefore the depersonalization of society is imminent. This is a politically motivated message, but it's also, to some extent, anti-political. A view that politics have been obviated, and therefore an interest in what will happen now the course of the future is set. Again, I'll come back to this later. Like cyberpunk at its best, Inception is about using this imagined hypothetical technology and genre tropes to talk specifically about problems of identity and control. It's so direct in this respect that I might have rewritten this essay to be about Inception is just Blade Runner for 2010 if it weren't standing at 5,800 words as I write this sentence. Inception takes place in a world of total corporate power, not one in which they have supplanted states, but one in which they have suborned states. Competition between corporations is the locus of power. Like Blade Runner and Neuromancer, Inception observes that in such a world, this fact is not treated internally as dystopian, but as the basic state of the world. Cobb is caught in what turns out to be a three-way power struggle between three rival companies, Cobol Engineering, his original employer, which is threatened in some way by Saito's expansion plans. The company controlled by Saito, a conglomerate so large and powerful that it can buy airlines without anyone caring too much, which I believe is unnamed in the film, but is apparently called Proclus Global in spin-off comics, and Fisher Morrow, the company that Robert Fisher is about to inherit. which apparently poses a significant threat to even such a large conglomerate's operations. And how powerful are they? Well, we don't know for sure. And the best thing we have to go on is one exchange between Cobb and Saito. Saito, how would you like to go home to America, to your children? Cobb, can't fix that. No one can. Saito, just like Inception. We know that Cobb is wanted in the United States for fleeing a murder charge, and that these huge corporations don't much mind working with him. And we also know that Saito can make, or says he can make a phone call and make it go away. We don't know if that's true, but it could be true. And think about that level of power, not just to be able to make that kind of charge go away, but to be able to make a call as a plane lands and have this charge be dropped by the time you get to customs. Is this the world of today? Maybe. But if it is, it's a very, very specific way of talking about looking at the world of today. As in cyberpunk, Cobb is a more or less noirish hero, alienated from society, permanently reeling from the thing that left him disconnected, and which he can't recover from. In noir, the city is portrayed as labyrinthine, not confusing, but inescapable, something explored in more detail in Dark City. But here, instead of being inside one city, the movie is about descending into a network of such labyrinths, and just as noir uses hotels, bars, in a slightly paranoid way that gets at the alienation, the lack of a home life, and connects that to characters having private conversations in places where they are not actually in private. Inception takes place descending through these kinds of scenes, in realms where there literally is no privacy, where another person's subconscious could be, is, spying on your mind at every moment. There is a constant framing of the dreaming technology as a form of drug use, which one can get addicted to, which in fact Cobb is mentally addicted to, which gets back to the punk drug addiction that Neuromancer, for example, is using to make the hero seem more pathetic. And again, the film is obsessed with the deconstruction and reconstruction of identity. The whole movie is about the hero changing someone's identity to serve the interests of some corporate bigwig and doing it because that guy has leverage over the only thing left in the hero's life, while the hero's identity, his personality, is literally destroying him from the inside. And the face of that self-destruction is literally his trauma inhabiting the form of a noir femme fatale, and explicitly in the text, the reason she is occupying that form is that Cobb has subconsciously cast her into it. Because, quote, I can't imagine you with all your complexity, all your perfection, all your imperfection. Look at you, you're just a shade. Cobb's psychological alienation is produced by this technology that he is supposed to be essentially one of the great hackers of. His disconnect from society is a product of that technology and his expertise in it and the way that that technology is built into global systems. There's even the score, which we now associate with a wall of sound technique that the popularity of Nolan's films has made faddish, and the score isn't a purely electronic ambient score like Vangelis did, but I bet you can hear a similarity in genre and some elements between, say, Blade Runner's blush response and Inception's Mombasa. At least as much as, for example, Zimmer's later work on Blade Runner 2049, that's supposed to be consciously invoking it, but honestly to me just sounds like the THX Deep Note. If Inception is narratively about characters and plot that are straight out of cyberpunk, and it's thematically about the same things that cyberpunk is about, why doesn't it really feel like cyberpunk? Well, let's get into that in a second. And the few other progenitors who are less remembered now mostly missed the point and leaned into the formulas and the aesthetics. Though all three of Scott, Gibson, and Otomo had long and productive careers for different reasons, none of them as individuals were leaders of the subgenre as it emerged afterward. Scott and his creative team followed Scott's esoteric vision to different projects immediately afterward. Certainly, to a director pursuing mass appeal, Blade Runner would not have seemed to be a great success. Akira took forever to tell, and it would be more than a decade after the birth of the genre before Otomo's next major project was seen. And then there's Gibson. By around 1986, only 2 years after Neuromancer appeared, the world of science fiction literature was in civil war. Some of the newest generation of science fiction writers, led principally by Bruce Sterling, who I am spending this part of the essay trying not to call 4 different kinds of asshole, and also by John Shirley, had clamped onto cyberpunk not just as a way of telling a story, but as an identity which they leveraged in part by basically picking fights with the other generation of newer science fiction writers, the most significant of whom is Kim Stanley Robinson. To some extent, literally picking fights. There are stories of this pack of 25 and 30-year-old young science fiction dorks, dressed all in leather jackets and mirrored sunglasses, wandering around science fiction conventions, literally starting shouting matches with other writers. Sterling kind of appointed himself and the so-called cyberpunks the guardian of good science fiction, and along the way started saying a lot of very mean things about other up-and-coming writers who were writing anything other than cyberpunk, as well as a lot of things that I find kind of foundationally silly, like saying story doesn't matter to good fiction, or that science fiction really shouldn't comment on the present, or that cyberpunk is hard science fiction, and many other things that start off feeling silly and, in my opinion, get sillier the more you learn about them. Michael Swanwick, who was one of the people that Sterling and the other members of the cyberpunk pack elected to target, wrote a couple of essays that humorously and extremely gently suggested that there were interesting young writers who were both in the cyberpunk genre or in the opposing flank that he defensively called humanists, by which he seems to have meant that they left room for any tone other than overpowering fatalism. And these essays, which again are mostly about trying to amusingly say there's other interesting people than Gibson, provoked the people who took to calling themselves cyberpunks further and led the cyberpunks into a kind of ideological radicalism. And to be frank, that ideological radicalism from the loudest voices in the genre probably doomed the careers of any number of those fledgling humanist writers. But I haven't actually mentioned what Gibson was doing during all of this, and that's because Gibson wasn't much a part of it. Robinson criticized Gibson's work, and Gibson's work was the one of the newer writers that really took off. But Gibson, who had gotten into sci-fi writing a little bit later in life than some of the other so-called younger generation, and who was benefiting from the self-branding of his own popularity, clearly felt alienated from the whole effort to create a cyberpunk genre. Writing that, quote, "I'm usually very polite and I keep my tie on. SF authors are often strange, ill-socialized people who have good minds but are still kids." Specifically about cyberpunk, Gibson refused to personally connect with it as a movement, even in 1986, while still writing the hallmark Sprawl trilogy, saying equivocally that tying my stuff to any label is unfair. I can appreciate that the label gives writers a certain attitude that they can rally around, feel comfortable with. Really, though, I'm tired of the whole cyberpunk phenomenon. I mean, there's already bad imitation cyberpunk, so you know it can only go downhill from here. Speaking of what he read and was inspired by, Gibson continuously referred more to mainstream fiction and to much earlier science fiction. Gibson continued to write what's identifiable as cyberpunk for some years, the work that remains the best-known cyberpunk literature by far, but he maintained a distance that seemed to reflect both a social and creative discomfort with what authors who called themselves cyberpunks were doing. That discomfort left the genre in the hands of writers who were more attracted to the aesthetic and near-future setting than to the themes, and writers who were also autocratic about policing the boundaries of cyberpunk and, thanks to the faddishness of cyberpunk, what good science fiction was considered to be. And Gibson's discomfort comes from a position of not having to brand his work faddishly to sell it, but it also makes a lot of sense. There is something great there, but there's also a lot of weakness, even in those original great stories. I think the easiest way to talk about this is with what Kim Stanley Robinson, a great science fiction writer whose career started near and traversed the same time as cyberpunk, running all the way up to the present, said, quote, "Cyberpunk was somewhat anti-feminist with their hard noir gals. It was defeatist or non-political or collaborationist, like noir." Or in another place writing, quote, "It was basically saying finance always wins. All you can do is go onto the mean streets, find your corner, pretend you're in a film noir, and give up." And that's a pretty good summary. Even told well, there's the way the anti-globalization manifests as xenophobia. There's the persistent inability to engage with women and femininity. Not that there cannot be female characters by any means, but that within the techno-noir construct, the way to signal that female characters have agency is to assign them noirish masculine traits. And to be clear, there being no problem whatsoever with having an individual female character who takes on genre-identified masculine elements, but what this pattern does and recreates over a genre. Beyond those specific issues, there's the teenage naivety of the total political alienation and the fatalism. Cyberpunk is kind of the guy who sneeringly says, "Fuck politics. All politicians are corrupt," and so makes himself voluntarily unable to distinguish between the people who are trying to improve a flawed system and the people who are not. And it finds in the awful disconnection something romantic. Scott and Gibson see at least how hollow that feeling is. What's appealing about it, but also that it's not more than the refuge of a pathetic character forced into being pathetic. So they retain an element of satire. Their protagonists have these identities, but they aren't within their world, even within their social groups, cool. They're pitiable. And they get by largely on that pity, not even from their friends, which they lack, but of their business associates. Demonstrating awareness of the issue isn't really solving it, of course. Beyond the limitations of the best-loved stuff, the other problem is that while it's mimetic now to complain about people, quote-unquote, missing the point of cyberpunk, the reality is that missing the point is both as old as cyberpunk and by far the larger strain of it. After 40 years of that being true, you kind of have to treat that as an obvious and essential problem of what cyberpunk is as a construct, which is, while you can watch Blade Runner and be enriched by the ideas as the single experience of consuming a piece of art, the reason to hang out in the subgenre, to take it on as a writer, to give its authors a chance because they're in the genre, to play its games in video games, is for the aesthetic, the tone, the fantasy, the reconstruction of cyberpunk in which retreating to your xenophobic, anti-feminine, leather-jacketed, neon-illuminated corner is an act of heroism. And fair play, fantasy is an important part of fiction, but if what you're doing really is the same as steampunk, but for the 1980s instead of Victorian England, then it's hollow to then pretend that you're still taking part in the themes and meanings of those couple of great stories, the ones you especially loved, expounded specifically by satirizing what you're doing. On top of all of that is the problem that cyberpunk has always been a branding exercise. Another of the many things that Gibson instinctively understood that cyberpunk as a genre constitutionally cannot get its arms around is that the megacorporations are going to be the ones who sell you the counterculture too, who redefine it, manufacture it, package it, and advertise it. In fact, to the extent that cyberpunk itself is kind of a subculture, this has only ever been true and has only ever remained true because the people who created cyberpunk did it for media conglomerates and actively participated in turning it into the soulless branding exercise that they romantically dreamt of opposing. Far from an active, actual political opposition, cyberpunk is, in Robinson's phrasing, collaborationist with the thing that it claims to oppose. Can't be treated as surprising, then, that video games like Cyberpunk 2077 and Watch Dogs Legion, that are explicitly set as a branding exercise in the cyberpunk near future, are just romances about being out on the corner, being vaguely near future punk. Finally, there's the other time problem. If cyberpunk intended primarily to use the near future to hold a mirror up to the present, well, that present is now going on 40 years past. It's a huge problem for cyberpunk that, as everyone knows, what's happened in the intervening 40 years is not that the world turned out so differently, but that many of the social predictions did become more true. The problem is that cyberpunk, to the extent it ever worked thematically, worked by using the near future to present this heightened reality, and by using the intense focus on down-on-their-luck protagonists to leave vague the objective reality of the setting. But if the near future of 80s cyberpunk was a dark mirror of the 80s, today that reflection is just foggy. It's not well equipped to discuss the shades of the problems we do face because of its fatalistic, monomaniacal focus on capitalist alienation. You can try to bolt topics like resurgent white supremacy or post-imperialism or the return of old-fashioned autocracy or the lived experiences of racism and sexism, and this may even work in one story or another, but the genre wasn't built to discuss these. And so just being cyberpunk weakens how strongly you can focus on that. To a significant extent, this is really why, in the more than 30 years since that first wave of cyberpunk stories, there are only 2 new stories that are more or less purely cyberpunk and are treated as defining, and both of them are novels by one author. Some of those old cyberpunks and people who grew up reading them have started trying to call the fiction that cyberpunk, but aware of the problem and attempting to put a more productive spin on things, quote-unquote, post-cyberpunk, but I have some problems with that. The first problem is that it's not really post-cyberpunk to write near-future science fiction that talks about problems with corporatism but is about something more productive than alienation. Not only was that work contemporary with cyberpunk, it's specifically that humanist work that the self-identified cyberpunks demonized, attacked, and because the cyberpunks were the faddish work that they prevented from breaking out by defining it as both other and bad. The second problem, the one that's not me being persnickety about language, is that the conceptual gap between near-future science fiction and cyberpunk is exactly the length and breadth of the problem, departing into noir, into leather jackets on neon, into the world of megalopolies and hustlers and mirror shades is both A, precisely what now just makes the concept look like just another fantasy universe instead of a portrait of the near future, and B, specifically what brings in all of the implications of the genre that are what you're hypothetically rescuing it from. Which I think is why, to be blunt, the best cyberpunk-y stuff you can think of is stuff that leverages genre tropes of cyberpunk, but ends up settling itself firmly somewhere completely different, like, well, The Matrix or Dark City, both stories in which the techno-noir up-all-night punk scene is specifically another locus of control that you have to free yourself from rather than retreat into to be self-actualizing. The 13th Floor is also kind of about that, if it's about anything, but whatever. And all of that leaves you wondering, can you do the same things that made the best cyberpunk stories work, do them about today, instead of cosplaying the past? sees the way the disconnectedness of different kinds can be linked thematically, sees the massively unreliable narrator, sees the slight noticeable transformation of the present day, sees the heightening and misshapening of layers of reality and hallucination in a way that can tie the protagonist's mental state to the off-kilter status of the whole narrative, and through that to the viewer being kind of off balance. It sees all of it, and it correctly diagnoses it not as cyberpunk, not as a subset of a subset of a subset of genre fiction, but as really psychological drama that happens to be stepping into the science fiction genre. Inception takes a lot from Dark City and The Matrix, and through them, if not directly, it takes a lot from Blade Runner and from Gibson. But it's not being made self-consciously for people who love science fiction, who understand the heritage. It's not beholden to the genre. It cares about the ideas from the genre. The easiest part of this difference is the basic visual look. Unlike Dark City, unlike The Matrix, and stretching back to unlike Blade Runner, Inception opts for an extremely normal look. People and places presented from what are supposed to look like conventional angles and with a color grade that, although it varies a lot, feels closer to Ocean's 11 than film noir. The movie just doesn't look cyberpunky. Doesn't look like either science fiction or noir, and that's doing a lot of work to keep the story grounded. This world clearly isn't our own, but it doesn't obsess about 20 years in the future or in an alternate universe where X. It's just presented completely authentically. This is as if we're in present-day Earth. There's this anachronistic technology, and for all the times the movie helps you understand how the shared dream works, it never once walks you through all the various socio-political ramifications of shared dreaming. And not owing that lengthy genre debt in the design means that you don't see these darkly shadowed alleyways barely illuminated by a neon sign that would make you engage on the level of science fiction genres and subgenres with 40 years of past. This is a deliberate choice, and fortunately you don't have to take my word for it, because this is what Nolan talked about himself. And Nolan is thinking he wants to make sure he has the highest quality footage. He's in love with IMAX, remember? This is the guy who's now basically optimizing his films for the kind of perfect audio mix you mostly find in IMAX theaters and become unintelligible if you see them in the kinds of theaters huge parts of his audience is going to, who can't help himself in interviews to say how he loves IMAX and wants that great IMAX presentation. This guy skips filming on IMAX cameras for Inception because he can't get the ultra-realistic look he wants on the shots he wants, because IMAX cameras are physically large and noisy. And Nolan is going, I don't want this to look big and splashy and presented from a static position that feels like it's behind the set. I do not want this to look static and impressive like that. I want the camera moving like the audience is used to a camera moving inside a drama to make these shots look completely real. This is also behind Nolan's insistence on practical effects. The best way to make it look real is not to spend 9 figures making it look like the world's best CGI, it's to make the effect actually happen in front of the camera. It's why when the mountain fortress blows up at the end of the movie, it's not a CGI explosion. It's a medley of shots of multiple explosions of the fortress constructed in miniatures, and of them literally blowing up the full-size sets they built in Banff. And all of that is kind of the work of a prima donna director who is insisting on doing everything exactly his way, but it isn't Mission Impossible blowing up a real bridge because it would be cool if they blew up a real bridge. It's because Nolan thinks it is important. And I agree with him. I'm sure he appreciates the vote of confidence. The effect that pervades the film is the sense of slight disorientation in both the characters and the state of the plot. Cobb lies bald-facedly to Ariadne, then asks to hold her totem, which is incredibly dangerous. Then, when Ariadne refuses, he reframes as if it was a lesson. But was it? Close-ups of research the team has done are thrown in, but not for long enough to track them. At the end of a scene with multiple layers of dreaming, which followed straight on from an in medias res introduction, we're on a train in motion in the countryside, and then we're in a different scene at a different time with Cobb checking if he's still dreaming, and he could still be dreaming, but we have to find that out inside the scene. Even before we get into the dream, the effortless globe-trotting and the wait where are we feeling of the scenes is already being used to demonstrate the lack of stability and the disorientation of Cobb's life, and then we do get into the dream. A less disciplined director might feel a temptation to do something weird with each stage of the dream. Like, you go down one dream level and it's the noir world, and then you go down another level and it's the rotoscoped animated world, and then you go down another level and surprise, it's the layer that's about making movies in Hollywood. That might even be fun, but Inception is about the dream layers being distinguishable with a little effort. So there's the city, the hotel, and the mountain complex. They look different. You can tell the difference, but most of the same actors are in all the places and stuff's happening in all of them, and the movie is going fast. It's just destabilizing, and it constantly reminds you whenever in dreams that no one is really controlling it, that aspects of anyone's subconscious can change it, from Cobb's dead wife to Yusuf forgetting to use the restroom, and that the experiences people are having in the dream feel completely real while they're in the dream. The effect is kind of an inversion of the old paranoid fiction thing where you really didn't know when either the author or the narrator crossed the line from narrating fiction to meta lying about the fiction. Instead, Inception gives you total certainty that the things on the screen are the literal experiences of the characters, to drive home how flimsy and uncontrollable the literal experience of the characters is as an explanation of reality, as an explanation of the truth. It's basically the same reason the movie is so careful to adopt the heist movie archetype. We build the team, we assign each team member a role, we try to break in, things go wrong, we have to deal with the complications. The framework provides a reference that keeps you on board, enough that you can feel confused instead of lost. What people are missing with the videos that stack up all the dream levels like Inception is a ship in a bottle is that the imperfections in the storytelling, the way things feel like they might line up but also don't quite, or you can't tell quite in the moment, is what's doing most of the work. And that gets us to the ending. We talked before about how cyberpunk in its decline seemed to venerate the alienation, the retreat, the identity of being too cool to connect, and that cyberpunk at its best at least seems to parody that by escalating the pathetic noir elements to really high levels. Inception is doing something similar, but because it's not quite noir, the characters play straight instead of as subversion. Cobb looks cool, but his life is sad and empty. That's just true. That his facsimile of control is misleading. That he is misleading his colleagues into danger because of his need to seem to be in control is a key part of the plot. Inception's big moment of catharsis happens in 3 successive short moments. Cobb accepts that he has to move on from his pain. Then we cut to a different dream level where Robert Fisher says, "The will means that Dad wanted me to be my own man, not just to live for him." And then we cut back to Cobb now meeting Saito, to make an explicit callback to the inciting incident of the film when Saito asks, "Do you want to take a leap of faith, or do you want to become an old man filled with regret, waiting to die alone?" Cobb decides to move on, to go on with his life, and he wakes up and goes home, says hello to his kids. Is that ending real? There's a lot of it that doesn't quite hold together. You can go as deep as you want trying to figure out if the different kicks in the dream layers make sense, if the top is wobbling or not, what it means that the very last line of the movie is his son saying, "Look what I've been building, I'm building a house on a cliff." And you should notice this stuff. But since all of it has to be layered through multiple levels of uncertainty of the artistic deception that is filmmaking, there's nothing to do with it. Whether it's literally real doesn't not matter, but Cobb has realized, literally ventured into the deepest part of his subconscious and internalized that obsessing about it is just, well, collaborating with the destruction of his identity, collaborating with what was alienating him. Inception says, the refusal to rebuild when you lose, the refusal to find and chase what matters to you. That is the mechanism by which you contribute to being more limited than you have to be. That is the mechanism by which you are destroyed. Accepting your losses, even your most terrible ones, and growing, taking the leap of faith, is how you have an identity and do the things that you care about. And there's a lot you can critique about that. A lot about it that is subject to plenty of response. But it's at least a both constructive and relevant way of thinking about identity and alienation today.